All right, so we're very pleased to kick off this set of 5 breakout and focus sessions on important policy issues related to growth and productivity. And here in this room today, we'll be tackling a topic that has been mentioned in every single other session of the day, and that is interprovincial trade costs. Now this, it comes up a lot, of course, and I think it is important to keep in mind how important it is, and this is why it is brought up so regularly in all of the other sessions. There are thousands of individually modest but collectively significant barriers to investment and trade and migration, and this creates a kind of artificial wall between 13 provincial and territorial economies. And this comes at great cost to our productivity and living standards. Now, all federations struggle to balance regional autonomy and national unity, and some degree of interprovincial political and economic friction is, of course, unavoidable. But in Canada, which is one of the world's most decentralized countries, spanning vast geographies, these challenges are particularly acute. And so I'm really looking forward to diving into this issue, to explore what the significance of it is, what governments can do, what policymakers can do, what businesses can do, how businesses are experiencing some of these frictions. There's a lot to explore and unpack over the next hour or so. So I'm pleased to, introduce Goldy Hyder, who's President and Chief Executive Officer of the Business Council of Canada, and Laura Jones, President and CEO of the Business Council of British Columbia. So in this session, we're going to kick things off first with some opening remarks by Goldy, and then transition to a panel discussion that kind of unpacks a lot of the issues in this space in more detail, and have some time at the end for questions and answers with the audience as well. So I think that's enough from me. I will, invite Goldy to the stage, and please join me in welcoming Goldy Hyder, President of the Business Council of Canada.
Thanks, Trevor. And thanks to whoever arranged for me to follow Andrew Cohen. Andrew, of course, always leaves us wondering what he thinks about an issue, never clear about what he wants. No, it's great to be here. It's always great to be in Calgary, my hometown. I've got all my education and my formative years here, and some of that might come out as I speak with you because it's going to sound like a lot of stuff that for Albertans just sounds like a lot of common sense. My father likes to say that the problem in Canada is there are no problems, and that we're actually busy making them up. And there is no greater problem, I think, than interprovincial trade barriers that speaks to the lunacy of the policies that stand in the way of some of the progress that Andrew actually talked about. What can be said about interprovincial trade barriers that has not already been said, including throughout the panels today that we've heard? We're a free trading nation, and we have 15 trade agreements with 51 countries, 61% of the global GDP, 1.5 billion people that we can access. Obviously, we won the geographic lottery, being attached to the United States. But there's more free trade inside the European Union with 27 countries. There's more free trade inside the United States with 50 states than there is inside Canada. And it is one of my challenges in this job when new ambassadors and high commissioners come to take their role in Ottawa, where without fail, during their visit to me, they ask about what exactly, Goldy, are interprovincial trade barriers? We have a free trade agreement with your country. We have businesses that are seeking to invest in your country, and they come across these things that seem to be a complete violation of the free trade agreements that you have signed with actual countries, but have not signed with yourselves. Try explaining that one with a straight face. It really is a difficult thing to do. And it leaves them bewildered, and frankly, it leaves many people bewildered. But as we heard in our panels earlier today, one of the problems is the public doesn't know. The public doesn't know. To me, interprovincial trade barriers are like the debate around the MST versus the GST. People didn't know they were paying 13% on the MST. It was hidden. Until we explained to them and fought that fight, and I agree with the assessment, you wouldn't have believed, I was here at the University of Calgary then, you would not have believed that free trade was going to pass. But if there's one thing I've always believed, is do not underestimate the collective wisdom of Canadians. They're actually not a dumb group of people. They're a pretty smart group of people. They may not talk about these issues as much as we do, and they probably won't talk about them unless they're forced to think about them. But when they are given the options, they usually make the right choice. they usually make the right choice. So to me, one of the things we've not done well is explaining the problem that we're trying to solve, because they don't know that they have a problem. They don't know that they are going to be able to save as much as, what I think Trevor's study showed was a 6.9% tariff. In effect, what these interprovincial trade barriers are doing for consumers. That's 2 percentage points higher than the GST Canadians pay. 7% is being effectively, I'm rounding up here, the price that Canadians are paying without their knowledge for services and goods that they need and should be available to them freely in Canada as one country. Now, we know the obstacles. Many of them are driven by, sort of labor mobility issues. There are procurement issues. There are transportation issues. I mean, we don't even agree what a truck is. We have agricultural issues, including in beef, which obviously is very important to this province. And I know that we have all heard about the lack of choices in booze. And I'm not even a guy who drinks, and I've heard about that everywhere I go. So why is it that we're not able to get them to cue in on some of these issues? And because the impact is actually very real when you think about what the benefits are. And we need to sell the benefits as much as we sell the problem. Why should Canadians care? Well, back to Andrew's point, if you make it customer-centric, if you make it consumer-centric, it is they who receive choice. It is they who receive better price through that competition. The wages would rise in an environment in which you have more labor mobility. You would see an increase, according to the study again, of $2,100 of real GDP per person. And that's just an estimate. It could be higher. Yes, businesses would even improve their bottom lines. Yes, I'm talking about that dreaded word of profits these days, but what's wrong with profits? Usually it gets reinvested back in their workforce, and employees, and skills, in innovation, and the things that we are going to need to help our GDP grow. And in government, revenues themselves would increase. It's estimated federal government revenues would go up 6%, and provincial governments could go up as high as 4%. Now, I'm here with you in Calgary, in Alberta, in the province that really led the New West partnership that came about. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because we do want to focus on solutions, not just what the problems are or what the benefits are. Now, the New West partnership is really an example of how things work in Canada. We are incremental by nature. We don't normally take public policy leaps and bounds. We inch our way there unless it happens to be on something significant like free trade. So the New West Partnership has been working quite successfully for over a decade. And it's worked in 4 provinces in which there have been governments of different stripes, red, blue, and orange, in 3 of those provinces, or in 4 of those provinces, and yet that agreement exists to this day. So it tells you there's something there, and that we need to build off of that. The other track, of course, is the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and that's a little more complicated because, of course, you have to take into the equation the considerations around Quebec. But the New West Partnership, why can't we expand it? One of the things that we've been trying to do, and I've spoken personally with Premier Ford many times, as well as the finance minister in Ontario, to be able to say, would you please take a look at the merits of joining the New West Partnership? We'll rename the thing if you need it to be renamed. But come on board, because if you come on board, you create the conditions for other provinces to come on board. It'll force Quebec also to think about how it handles both the CFTA, or whether, in fact, we have another track where we are coming together. So we have something that we can latch onto. It may be a pilot. Things work in Canada. If you call it a pilot, it becomes a pilot for 10 years or 25 years, but at least we've made some public policy progress. For the moment, there are just simply too many exceptions, and we are going to require some bold actions. One of the other things, and I don't know if any federal government would have the courage to do it, but is to leverage their spending power to be able to say to provinces, listen, all we ever get from you is demands for more, and yet these trade barriers, according to former Governor Polos at the bank, amount to 4% of our GDP being suffocated in our own economy. That is an own goal, if there ever has been one. For all the things we want to say about what's happening down south, you take a look at what's going on in Canada. We stand in our own way of progress, and interprovincial trade barriers are probably the poster child of something we're doing to hurt ourselves more than anybody else can do to hurt us. And so we need to do something about that. Maybe the federal government needs to take some of the responsibility in the leadership role to use the spending power, to use the capacity to meet the demands that provinces are placing on them to say, you know what, in order to give you more, we're going to need you to lift these barriers. These barriers are standing in the way for growth, and that growth is necessary for us to be able to afford healthcare spending, infrastructure spending, education spending, something. Something has to give. We simply just cannot be having the same conversation again and again and again. That's the definition of insanity. And if ever there's a moment, unfortunately, I tend to believe that it will take a crisis. And we're on the way. Let's not kid ourselves that there's a lot of forces aligning against where we find ourselves: anti-globalization, anti-multinationalism, pro-protectionism. Don't have to look far. It doesn't matter who wins on November the 5th. They're both extremely protectionist. There are perfect storms forming here in which, if we don't get ahead of them, we're going to be too late to respond. And so we can avoid the crisis. I'd prefer to do that. But if we don't, we may well be on the cusp of one, and then we'll have no choice but to take some of the actions that are necessary, and ideas that Andrew's put out and others have put out over the course of the day. That's the kind of public policy discourse that we need to have. And again, Trevor, your work in this area is very important. I mean, you've got the facts, you've got the data to be able to show what is possible. So our message at the Business Council has been very simple. We need to get out of our own way. We need to get out of our own way on a lot of these public policy issues, not just in interprovincial trade barriers, but permitting reform. We don't build anything in our country anymore. We haven't looked at taxes since 50 years. The regulatory pressures that we're facing. If we can just get out of our own way, I think we can solve some of the problems that we've been talking about today. And I do believe very strongly that there's no lower hanging fruit with a bigger bang for our buck than interprovincial trade barriers. So I thank you all for the opportunity to be a part of the panel and to kick it off. And over to you, Trevor. Where would you like this? Does it matter?
All right, thank you, Goldy. And we're going to now transition to a panel discussion to explore some of these ideas. So I'd like to invite and join me in welcoming Laura Jones, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Business Council of British Columbia. It will be the three of us, so depending on when you accessed the app, you would have noticed a fourth name, but illness has brought us down to three, but I believe in us. I guess without further ado, I'll, Laura, turn to you. I mean, you've been a leader in this space for many years. I'm picturing this, I think to me is quite a famous photo in July of 2017 of you in your previous role with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business awarding the Golden Scissors to trade ministers from right across the country who signed the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, an internal within-country trade agreement. So I'm curious about your reflections on where we are now, where we've been, your optimism about where we might go from here.
Oh, what a great place to start. I remember that moment well. We gave Golden Scissors Awards to each of the interprovincial trade ministers, hoping to cheer them on to really good action. And the reason for that was that right from the very beginning of my time in public policy, trade barriers and their impact on the economy and our prosperity had been something that people were hand-wringing about. And the agreement on internal trade that came about in 1995 was widely seen as kind of just a complete disaster and not accomplishing the goals we needed it to accomplish. So then there were some great things that happened in the West that you talked about with the Trade and Investment Labor Mobility Agreement between Alberta and BC, which led to the New West Partnership, still the gold standard, I think, with respect to these agreements. But in 2017, we had the Canada Free Trade Agreement come into place. And we recognized that it was a lot better than what we had. So don't get me wrong, I think it is far from perfect, and I'm gonna come to where I think we need to be a lot bolder. But let's remind ourselves that before this, we had a positive list approach in the agreement on internal trade, which meant that only things that were listed in the agreement were subject to the agreement. So what the Canada Free Trade Agreement did was move us to a negative list. That was a very good thing. The other thing it did was it created this reconciliation table, this regulatory reconciliation table. So for the first time, we had a place to go, and we had these irritants. Some of these irritants we heard about, like, well, if you stack hay on a truck one way, you hit the BC-Alberta border and you have to restack it, because this was one that came up when the first agreement between BC and Alberta was in place. And there was no place to take those things, that you need different work boots if you're working in one province versus another province, different eye protection, different fall protection. Gravity works the same way, whether you're in Newfoundland or in British Columbia, so can't we accept each other's fall protection rules? So for the first time, we had a place to take those things. But where I'll leave my introductory comments are, we gave an award, but we also gave a warning at that time that we're going to be watching you. And we started a report card that the Canadian Federation of Independent Business still does. And by the way, nobody gets a stellar grade on that report card, to start monitoring some of these things and encouraging more transparency around these things. And I think that while the new reconciliation table, well, it's 7 years old now, has done some good things, we need to get a lot bolder.
So Goldy, you mentioned the role of the federal government, potentially conditionality of federal transfers using the federal spending power. I do want to turn to the federal government in a bit, but sticking with provinces, I mean, a lot of people don't, I guess, realize what interprovincial trade costs are. They're just differences in rules and regulations and standards and certifications. And you know, this morning in the fireside conversation with the Premier, Heather asked about interprovincial trade, and the Premier noted, you know, challenges around wine, liquor, and that's often where provincial politicians will go, and usually it kind of stops short of that. Do you have a sense, and Laura, you as well, what's stopping provincial governments and provincial leaders in particular from actually taking this issue a little more seriously than it seems they do?
Boy, if I knew the answer to that, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because I do think there is a lack of sort of the ambition and the courage to just deal with some of these things that have been long-standing in our country. You know, it's silly. I mean, you talked about the obvious stuff that we hear a lot about. I mean, we dispute toilet seats, creamers, nuts and bolts. Like, I have members who tell me the amount that they spend on regulatory compliance. Who do you think's paying that? Right? You are. And so I think that the lack of hearing about this is kind of like the entire conference about productivity. I remember Jim Flaherty saying to me once, I will never use that word, because no one's ever used that word at a door. No one's ever said to me, you know, I care about productivity, because it's what you think about it, what it is. I just don't feel like people are aware this is a problem. Why would they be aware? Right? It's just like the MST. Until we debated the MST in a free trade election, nobody knew. We happily paid the 13% that our furniture costs more. We didn't know. And so there was a theme in an earlier panel with Hannah and others when it came to the media and the storytelling and all of that. I think one of our responsibilities here is, on the one hand, obviously get out the facts, get out the data, communicate the pain that's being there. But we need to show, not just tell. I think people have to see the benefits of the actions, because then the political people will respond. Unfortunately, we are living in an era where, with the greatest respect to those who seek public life, and boy, do I respect you, I sure as heck wouldn't do it, but they have said, basically, we are followers now. You go build me a parade of whatever issue it is that you want me to change rules on, and I'll do it. So the onus is now falling on us to create, you know, public support for something they don't even know is a problem. And that's why I think we're stuck. It's not an issue.
Well, this morning, I mean, we've heard several times about Carolyn Rogers talking about breaking the glass on productivity. When you listen to her speech, she goes on and she talks about the importance of having the right tools. So she talks about shoveling a driveway with a better shovel, and then a snowblower, and then, you know, a snowplow, and how that increases productivity and our ability to do the job. So let me use a different but parallel analogy. I think when it comes to interprovincial trade barriers, it's lots and lots and lots of little barriers that are causing us big productivity challenges. So it's like we have this big pile of small rocks, in the middle of our productivity road. And the tools we've been using to deal with this big, giant pile of small rocks is let's pick them up one at a time, look at them, get 13 leaders, provincial leaders together to discuss whether we should move this rock. Then they agree to moving the rock, maybe, and then they each have to go back into their provincial cabinets to pass the regulations that allow them to move that rock. And they wonder why people are frustrated. So we need to get out the bulldozer. And so let me make this a little bit more concrete, what I'm talking about. So instead of talking about work boots and eyeglass protection, those are important, but instead of dealing with those, and first aid kits, does anyone remember what a big deal the first aid kits were? We had premiers jumping up and down about that one. What about saying we're gonna mutually recognize each other's health and safety standards? So if you're meeting workers' compensation rules in one province, that's good enough for us. And if there's some reason that we think the fall protection isn't good enough for the eyeglasses, we're gonna negative list that piece of it. That would be getting out the bulldozer instead of taking these things one rock at a time. And I think mutual recognition is starting to get a bit of traction, to give people a little bit of hope, but it's getting traction kind of in the wrong, well, not in the wrong way, but it's too slow. Ministers meet to drive progress on internal trade. This is just from a few weeks ago. And so what are they excited about? They're excited about a mutual recognition pilot project in the trucking sector. That sounds good until you read a little bit further down. They could recognize one another's regulatory requirements in areas like driver medical requirements, training requirements, time of day definitions, oversized. So in other words, what they're doing is they're taking each rock. Why don't you just take all the rules in the sector and say we mutually recognize each other's rules, except for these kind of exceptions, which is the negative list approach that we took on the trade side. So that would be thinking boldly, because I really don't want to be here 10 years from now still talking about how we can't ship wine from one province to another. It's crazy.
This issue, I was just going to say, Trevor, reminds me a lot of the national securities regulator issue. It's a cottage industry. We get together every 10, 15 years and say, oh my God, we've got to do something about this. Why do we have 13 securities regulators? But the way we make progress in this country, and I'm not judging it, it's just the way it is incrementally, unfortunately. So what worked over there, I'm familiar with that file a bit, it was mutual recognition. It was a passport model. It was some mechanism to say, okay, you can have your 13 fiefdoms, but we're going to make it a little bit easier to deploy capital and to be able to move it around the country because you're going to mutually recognize, you're going to agree. You can compete, to Andrew's point earlier, you can compete to get that capital to come to your province, but it doesn't get to stay just in your province. It's able to have the mobility because, again, many of that capital is coming probably from countries with whom we have a free trade agreement. And so there may be a lesson there to learn. The mutual recognition piece, or again in Canada, long been an advocate, not an advocate, I guess I've long recognized that one of the ways forward with governments, mostly whom are risk averse, is through pilot projects. Hey, this is not permanent, this is just temporary. I remember doing one on what was called transit without visa. This was all a concern about airlines coming from China landing in Vancouver. Nobody was claiming refugee status. They were on their way to America. Believe me, they weren't going to stay here. But the way we got it across the finish line was a pilot project. And it became a pilot project for a decade, and then voila, it got converted into permanent. So we may need to think differently, even though many of us would want to just pick up all the rocks.
Well, so I agree with you on the pilot project, and I totally understand that we're not necessarily going to get out the world's biggest bulldozer all at once. But what I'm saying is, even when we have these pilot projects on mutual recognition, let's take the transportation rules and say all of the rules other than or negative list, or take health and safety and say all of the rules rather than negative list. What we're doing, and with a negative list, what we're doing right now is we're basically still saying rule by rule, but we're saying within this sector. So I just don't think it's ambitious enough to deliver the change that we want. And I do think mutual recognition, particularly with a pilot project on a big enough set of rules that we can then expand on, it's brilliant in that it's fast. We can do it quickly. And it still respects that a province has jurisdiction over its own regulatory standards. But we're just saying, look, isn't that kind of common sense that if it's safe enough for Manitoba, it's going to be safe enough for Alberta? And where it's not, you, provincial governments, still have the ability to have that negative list and have that exemptions. But if we want big results, we need to think more boldly when it comes to the policy. And what I'm seeing in these pilot projects is kind of more of the same, only with mutual recognition somewhere in the title. That's my complaint about it.
So in addition to the recent development within the trucking sector, which I think is incremental but meaningful, and hopefully it is an example for what can be done in other areas, Ontario's taken an interesting new direction in terms of its unilateral recognition of certain types of credentials in what they call the as-of-right exemption for physicians, surgeons, certain types of registered nurses, and medical laboratory technologists, and so on, where basically Ontario is saying, if you're credentialed in these areas in any other province, you're good to go in Ontario. So mutual recognition can be adopted unilaterally by a province. Do you have a sense of whether that's an appropriate model to think about more broadly, and what the barriers to provinces adopting that might be?
I think that's the kind of leadership that we need, quite frankly, right? Because it's, as you said, they don't need permission to speak with anybody else. They can just say, here, in Ontario, we recognize that, you know, a donut in Alberta is a donut in Ontario. Shouldn't be that hard to do. But not to be Debbie Downer about this, but you look at, you know, we say we need a crisis. We had one. It was COVID. And during that time, we wouldn't let our health professionals move around. I mean, it took exemptions. I mean, Scott Moe, I think, and Jason Kenney and others said, you know what, we're going to allow for labor mobility at this time. And even in that pandemic, in a national crisis where lives were at stake, we got in our own way when it came to health professionals. So I feel like, what will it take for us to tear these darn things down?
Well, first of all, love the unilateral approach, because I think then you can get people to follow suit, and it's very hard to get 10 provinces and 3 territories to all hop at the same time. You know, that's very slow.
But we made a trade agreement with Europe with 27 countries.
Yeah, right? Okay, you're right there, but you're right there. But the other point you raised about recognizing credentials, I think, is really important. But again, we seem to take this approach, oh, we've got a problem with nurses, so let's recognize everyone else's nurse credentials. Why aren't we saying we're recognizing credentials except where there's some good reason not to? And that's the shift. And we made that big mental shift when it comes to the good side of it when we moved from the Agreement on Internal Trade to the Canada Free Trade Agreement. We took that we went from a positive list to a negative list. And that, I think, is the mental shift we need on regulatory standards and on credential recognition. And there are some good reasons not to. Sometimes a hygienist in Alberta apparently has more training, a dental hygienist in Alberta has more training than one in British Columbia on administering some anesthesia and that kind of thing. So, but you could say we recognize your credential, except if you want to work in BC, you need this extra bit of training to fill that gap. And I think that's a way better starting point than starting from all of the little pieces.
We should also make sure that we align with sort of the discussion and the narrative of the day. And today is a ripe opportunity. What's the biggest issue in the public? Affordability. Well, what is it that's making things unaffordable? Andrew pointed out Bill C-282. I don't know if he mentioned it by bill, but that bill is ludicrous for a country that is a free trading, saying that we're going to exempt supply management discussions. But the issue is it's going to cost you more. That what you're already paying now for milk and for cheese, I think it's just going to cost you more later, even more. So that's latching on to the issues to say interprovincial trade barriers are in fact an issue around affordability. You are paying more for things than you need to. Might get the political attention because that's what they're hearing at the door. Life's too expensive. Well, here's one of the reasons it's too expensive. We have provinces who can't agree on a toilet seat or a creamer or any of these other things.
The toilet seat is one of my favorite examples.
It is. I keep saying it.
I don't know
nothing else, they'll remember that.
I don't know if people know what we're talking about when we're talking about the toilet seats, but it's in. I think this is right, Goldy. That for a construction site in Ontario, the seat needs to lift.
Correct.
But everywhere else, the seat be
stay down.
fixed. So in other words, if you are manufacturing these fixed seats, you basically can't sell them into the Ontario market. So it's effectively a barrier to trade.
As my dad said, we don't have enough problems, so we make them
I still don't know the good reason for that. I don't know what the rationale for that is. If someone could tell me, I'd be grateful.
I could do so much with that toilet seat, but I'm letting it go, and there seems to be some young people in the audience, so.
So I want to dig into the politics here a little bit. So you both engage with a diverse group of members in your own organizations. You advocate on their behalf, engage with governments of all parties. And trade in general, and Andrew noted it in his remarks earlier, that there are interests who benefit and who know they benefit from the current arrangements that exist, and the benefits of liberalizing, which enhances competition, lowers prices, improves growth, is diffuse and broadly spread across the population. So most people don't know the costs we're incurring from maintaining these barriers. Do you see that dynamic in the business community, or do you see that pressure on governments where they know who the interests are that would be disadvantaged from moves to liberalize? And that's, I guess, pressure they'd like to avoid igniting.
Well, this is certainly one of the trickier parts of my job, because I'm not an industry association head, right? I'm at the Business Council of Canada. We cover off all the sectors and right across the country, and frankly, most of our companies are very global. In fact, I have companies who are in some of the businesses that are protected, and I do speak with them, and I ask them, and they say, well, look, what we have to go after is what problem are we trying to solve, and whether the carte blanche approach that's in place is as necessary today as it might have been 20 years ago or 50 years ago. You take, for example, on dairy, what the Americans really want is access to things that are longer storage shelf life items. They're not necessarily out to compete on some of the other things. Well, let's look at how you can tear down that one then, if that's the case, in terms of supply management externally. But then they look at you and they say, well, you have the same thing going on internally inside your own country. So it's really rich of us to lecture countries when it comes to protectionism and stuff, when in fact we're endorsing it and practicing it right here at home. So businesses are trying to point out, and I think earlier many of their panels have referenced, that no one's actually fearful of competition. We're ready to compete. We don't need the protections to do it. What we want is a level playing field. And in most cases, the people actually standing in the way of competition is government. Government policies on spectrum, government policies on airline fees and airport fees and CATSA fees, and you name it. You go down the list of bank charge. All of these things are related to government regulations and government fees. This is an example where I think that business is saying, you know, let's get out of our own way. We will happily compete across the country. We're competing with the globe. Why wouldn't we want to compete for our services inside our own country?
I think larger businesses are in favor of it. We both work at business councils, and I see that in my previous job at the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. 88% of small businesses are in favor of it. So I think there's strong support, but it's also not in the top 3 issues that preoccupy businesses, big or small, I would say. So that puts it sort of lower on the priority list. But I want to just address one other thing, because we're talking a little bit about international and how we're seen by those outside of Canada. And I think this is something that is seen as a big challenge outside of Canada. But I've advocated on this file for a long time. And one of the things I hear from those in government, well, you know, we ask people where the irritants are, and they don't really come forward with much. So, therefore, we must not have a very big problem here. Now, I don't think that's true. I think it's the nature of the problem is lots of small things that add up to this big pile of rocks that I'm talking about. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that that's true for a moment, that we actually don't have a big problem here. It still would send an enormously positive message to international markets. The perception of Canada would change if we were to do something very bold on this file. But the fact that we continue to argue about wine does not send the message that we are ready to do anything bold on this file. And those very visible ones are really the ones that catch the headlines, and they do catch the headlines outside of Canada. Let's not make any mistake about that.
Well, we do have a problem, right? The problem we've talked about today. There's no growth. There's no growth. The only growth we're seeing in Canada is population. And now that's being mismanagement, so now we have a problem with worrying about even future population growth to address the issue of no growth. So when a former governor of the Bank of Canada says, hey, there's these things called interprovincial trade barriers, acting on that would allow your growth to go 4% to GDP, what does it take? Like you're not achieving growth in other places, but you have these handcuffs on yourself. The keys are available to you. You just have to open them up and unleash. That's the problem that we're trying to solve. Where will growth come from? One of it is getting out of our own way. And interprovincial trade barriers, which really for us is a consistent response from our members. We survey them every year, 3 times a year at our meetings. The number one issue every year since I've been here has always been regulatory burdens. It's the regs that are keeping us from investing, the regs that are giving us the lack of predictability, stability. It's the regs that are driving up costs. It's the regs that are preventing us from getting the labor mobility that we need. We want labor mobility across North America, never mind inside Canada. So many of our members are manufacturing or operating in 3 countries. I was in Mexico yesterday, and several of our members are down there who have higher member employees down there saying, I need a plant manager in Ohio where the unemployment rate might be 0 because it's about 3-4% in the US right now. But I can't move that person. I'd love to move somebody from Calgary or wherever down into Mexico City. I need some expertise. I need some knowledge transfer. Can't do that. So these are the things that are standing in the way for growth to come about. And of them all, none of them gives you a faster hit, a faster high than interprovincial trade barriers, as your own studies have shown, Trevor.
So we've talked a lot about provincial governments, about business and industry. I want to, now think about the federal government and its role in this space. So Goldy, you mentioned conditioning federal transfers on making progress in certain areas. I think that is probably not something we might see in the short term, especially here in Alberta.
It's easy for me to say, I'm not the one sitting there.
Especially in Alberta, there's, of course, in lots of parts of the country, sensitivity around the federal government involving itself in area of provincial jurisdiction. And in most of the areas we're talking about that are the source of frictions for interprovincial trade, those are areas of provincial jurisdiction. So putting aside conditionality of federal transfers, what's the role that the federal government can play to make progress on interprovincial trade? Are there some low-hanging fruit for that order of government? I think it's obvious that there's a lot provinces can do. What can the federal government do?
Well, a lot of what we've talked about today is about leadership. The absence of it, the lack of leaders to insert themselves and to bring people together, to use their convening power, to bring to the table the facts, the information, the data, and to engage in an adult conversation based on those facts and that data about the answer to the question, what do we want to be when we grow up? What got Canada to be where it's at today is not going to get us to where we need to go. And so the conversation that needs to be had at a federal level is, how are we going to grow our economy? How are we going to create prosperity? How are we going to meet the needs of the demographic realities that we've been hearing about all day today about where we're going to be in a matter of just, 25 years? Who's going to pay for all of that? How much guilt do you feel about the environment we're leaving behind our kids and our grandkids when every other generation before us, for the most part, made life better? We're hardly doing that for them. So the power of convening, we don't even do FMC meetings anymore. We don't actually bring our country together. For too many people, it was a cash shakedown, so they stopped coming, and they're not being held. We need a stronger federation. We need to function like a country. We need the leadership that a federal government's supposed to provide. And it can't be meeting each other in court as premiers and as a federal government. I think Canadians deserve that. They're not going to be perfect, but we do deserve adult conversations on serious issues that really affect the well-being of the generations to follow. That's not happening. That's not happening. The definition of long-term planning in Canada seems to be, what are you doing this weekend?
Well, to give some credit, I would say I think there was some leadership on the Canada Free Trade Agreement, and as many challenges as we have, I would say that it was better. Let's remember where we started from. So we have made some progress. They did set up this regulatory reconciliation and cooperation table, which, as I've said, has not been nearly ambitious enough. But for the first time, we have a place to take irritants. But The federal government can show leadership by making sure its own side of the street is clean.
True.
So there are some irritants that have been irritants for decades, for as long as I can remember, as long as I've been in the business. I've been hearing about the fact that you can't take meat across provincial lines. So you can't sell meat. You can produce it in Alberta, but you can't sell it in BC for some of the smaller and mid-sized.
And they've said they'd unilaterally bring those down, but they haven't.
They did, yeah. I think there's a pilot. Again, we're slow in our ambition, right? And you know, there already was a pilot. It was called COVID. During COVID, nobody wanted the supermarket shelves to be bare of meat. So a lot of these regulatory restrictions were quietly eliminated temporarily. Well, I'm not aware of any negative consequences from allowing that Alberta meat to make it to British Columbia supermarket shelves. So why do we need another pilot to study it some more? I think we need to get more ambitious and we need to get bolder in getting rid of these things. And I think the federal government should be looking at every single one of their exceptions under the agreement, and I know they've been getting rid of some of them, so that's good, but they need to be as bold as they possibly can be. Otherwise, what happens is I hear the provinces say, oh, well, the feds are complaining about us, but actually look at all these problems they have.
So maybe pushing back a little bit or digging more into your comments, Laura, and pushing back against Goldy. I've seen over now several years interest in the federal government, both the previous Conservative government and the current Liberal government, successive budgets recently putting resources towards the Canadian Free Trade Agreement and the Secretariat there, utilizing the convening power in the Committee of Internal Trade annually. I think that the recently announced trucking pilot is an example of some of the fruit of that, dropping some of the federal exemptions. But Laura, I take your point about maybe the lack of ambition relative to what actions needed to really move the needle in this file. And I wonder if it's just an issue that is not a priority anywhere in the country in the center of government. I mean, for whatever reason, and maybe you have thoughts on this, governments seem to function only if premiers or the prime minister wants a certain outcome to occur. It's almost as if, and apologies to ministers, and if there are any in the room, ministers don't matter, just to oversimplify it a little bit. And unless you can get the attention and the dedication and the interest on the part of the center, then ambition is impossible. Like and I guess that would be my impression of things. Is that a fair impression? Do you think that's a relevant barrier here to make progress? Is it something that affects provinces more than the federal government?
I think the provinces that have done the best job of this have had leadership from the top, from the Premier's office. I think that's true, and I think you also see this in another way. And well, it leads me to lead me to think about another point, and that's the importance of transparency. So we've talked about this regulatory cooperation and reconciliation table. They worked on 30 different things, so things like the work boots, the first aid kits. Now, for years, there was no place you could even go and see what progress. You had to go to every single province, and I know this because we worked on a report card at CFIB on this, and we said, okay, what agreements are you even negotiating? How many are there? Who has agreed to them? But then, importantly, agreeing to them at that table is the easy part, but this comes to your leadership part. So they've worked on 30 things. Only 5 of them have been fully agreed to. 5 in 7 years. So many of them have been implemented, they've been agreed to. Many of them have been agreed to. I think 17 have been agreed to, but only 5 have been fully implemented across all the provinces. And that's because they come back to the provincial level and there are changes that need to be made. So yeah, the ambition and the leadership from the center is important, but so too is transparency. Now I'm pleased to say that table now has this on their website after much advocacy on the part of my former employer, CFIB, to make that happen. And so that's a positive change. But there are also things that we can do from outside of government to push from the work you're doing, the report cards, pushing for more transparency. And I think that's also really, really important.
I agree with all of that. I'll just add what I said earlier, and that is that I think the low-hanging fruit right now is to get Ontario to join this new West Partnership. What they face is the issue of usually the Department of Finance saying, but oh my God, that's going to cost us a lot of lost revenue in X, Y, and Z. We're not looking at the bigger picture of the revenue increase across the rest of the country in terms of GDP growth and how that makes its way back into the system and how that makes its way around through job growth, taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the short-sighted, immediate thinking about, yeah, but I'm going to lose X amount of money in my department or in my government. I want to be compensated for that. Well, let's have that conversation if that's the case. Maybe there's a bridge that needs to be given if you're going to be joining the New West Partnership. If you do face some kind of income loss around the booze is usually what they point out, right? But that shouldn't stand in the way of the country benefiting for 4% GDP growth. Even if Stephen Poulos is wrong and it's 2%, that's still 1% more than we're on forecast for. By not my admission, by the finance minister's own admission. You look at the budgets, Andrew will tell me if I'm wrong, but 1.2, 1 point something is the forecast for growth in our budgets. That's a rounding error. That's just population growth. So if we can get out of our own way and get to even 2, 3, 4%, why wouldn't we do it and then compensate if there is some short-term pain? But we shouldn't let that kind of narrow, short-sighted, short-term thinking of my department will lose money or my government will lose money stand in the way of the greater good. Either we're a country or we're not. If we're going to be 10 provinces and 3 territories, then we should be the European Union. But let's not pretend to be one nation at that time, because that's not how we're functioning. And we need to get Canadians to realize that it's they who are suffering as a result of all of this.
So I'll just note we have about 15 minutes left in the session, so this would be a good point to invite anyone who has questions. I think we do have the microphone stands there in the aisle. And this, perhaps uniquely among issues, touches individuals who've ever moved across borders. It touches businesses who sell or operate across borders. So feel free also to share an interesting anecdote if you don't actually have a question. And while I see some actually lining up, I'll just re-emphasize the economic benefit of Ontario joining the New West Partnership Agreement. I did some work actually specifically on this earlier this year, finding potential GDP gains of a little over $4 billion just for Ontario of that agreement, because we know from the Western provinces, we can measure the effect of this agreement on interprovincial trade costs. And the effect is modest, but modest changes can have large implications for GDP. As an aside, if finance in Ontario is worried about revenues, I find revenues would grow by about $420 million a year. So some gains both in the economy and for the government's budget. But I think I'll turn to the microphone here on the left for our first question.
Sure. Thanks, Trevor. I'm Catherine Rothrick. I'm the chief economist for the province of Alberta. And you've kind of already touched on some of this stuff, but it'd be nice to kind of pull it all together. My question, when you were talking about the negative list and some of the costs and things like that, different provinces, we talked about the liquor specifically and potential lost revenue. But overall, if a province like Alberta or even Ontario, but let's talk about Alberta because we're here, if Alberta just decided tomorrow, let's look at this, adopt this sort of negative list policy. Let's do that across the board. Do you think, apart from maybe some of these bits and pieces around revenue, potential for lost revenue, do you think there is some sort of systemic risk or barrier to doing that? Is there a bit of short-term pain for long-term gain? Or do you think that really there's just all upside to taking that kind of an approach? Because I'm just wondering, with all the discussion, is this a cultural issue, or are there some concerns about, okay, if we were to do this tomorrow, could we lose out somehow, or is it just upside as a province?
Well, I think there's always, you always have to be careful in public policy because there can be the unintended consequences. I think rarely do you find issues that are 100% upside. But would I be confident that that would be a net very, very positive? Yes. And I think that if you took a mutual let's say you unilaterally decided to mutually recognize everyone else in Canada's health and safety regulations. Let's just take that as an example. I have found in my experience, regulators are very, very good at finding where the problems might be with that, at saying, well, hold on a minute, we can't recognize the dental hygienists from BC because they don't have this part of training. But if that were our starting point and we had a reasonably ambitious timeline, I think you would find those things, and then you would find those creative solutions to those things. And it's a bolder, out-of-the-box, different mindset. And I'm not saying you have to mutually recognize all of the rules and regulations all at once, but take a whole class, a class that would be meaningful, like health and safety. And rather than saying, okay, what within this class are we going to look at? Are we going to look at the boots and the eyeglasses and the fall protection, and like, let's take our time to really figure out this. Say, no, we're going to do it all unless we're not doing it. And what are those things that we shouldn't be doing and why? And regulators are pretty good at keeping citizens safe.
I'm not just playing to the crowd here, but if it's going to happen, I think it starts here, and it started here, right? To give credit to Premier Kenney. Even during COVID, he was willing to see nurses move around, and he brought in labor mobility at a time in which you would think you would want to be protectionist and insular. Healthcare may be one of the conduits in which to really get Canadians engaged, because it is a place where they get frustrated, right? Why am I waiting in emergency so long? Why is it taking so long to get an X-ray taken? Why is it so long to get an MRI done? When they understand that these issues are driven by labor and also by the whole issue around skills, mobility, and accreditation and so forth, they may say, well, how do I fix that? Why is it that somebody in another province is getting something faster than I am? I thought I'm in the same country. That once we create that pressure around an issue, and healthcare may be that issue simply because of the demographics, but also how personal it is, right? I mean, it's happening all the time. There's someone that we know that's affected by the consequences of that. And I think we need to push maybe heavier on how the interprovincial trade barriers are standing in the way of delivering better quality health care in a more expeditious manner than we currently receive it. Mm-hmm. That might capture the imagination of Canadians than some of the other issues that we've been talking about.
I agree with you, because I think the heads are nodding around things like, our nurse practitioners, for example. Why wouldn't we recognize the credential?
If you're a nurse, and I can see you when I'm in
Canada.
Alberta if I'm visiting, but apparently you can't come to me in Ontario.
It also speaks to, as parents, we want our kids to be able to work in different provinces, right? So it taps into that, that whole side of it as well. But I just wanted to make one other point, and that is that I think, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it might be, this would have been a really big job to sort of say, well, where are there differences that might matter or not, or undermine safety? But we have AI now. Like, this actually should be fairly easy to compare, like, well, are there some significant differences between nurse practitioners across provinces that we need to pay attention to, or dental hygienists, or whatever the other categories are? And this would be a fantastic project for the country, and it would send a fantastic message to the world about where our mindset is around these things. It would be like, we're getting with it, and we're modern.
The center microphone here.
Hi, yeah, my name is Fred Litwinick. I'm from Litco Law here in Alberta. My question, and you started to speak about it just briefly a minute ago, about the benefits of reducing these interprovincial trade barriers to everyday Canadians. So I'm wondering, is there a way, do you think, that we could enumerate the benefits or the detriments of not doing anything to everyday Canadians, and then use that as a way to build almost like a grassroots sort of movement? Because it sounds like, if everyday Canadians were made aware of all the detriments and the potential benefits, that it would be something that would be broadly in favor. And now, I guess a lot of Canadians are probably broadly in favor of telecom deregulation and of, airline deregulation and of cheaper milk, but that doesn't happen. But I'm just wondering, is there a place where we can motivate everyday Canadians to help push for this?
Maybe we need a 6.9% campaign.
I know.
Right? Take Trevor's study and say, you're paying 6.9% more for everything that's on this list here. How do you feel about that?
But
because
I think
that's what the study
put
shows.
A price tag on it. You did put a price tag on it for individuals, did you not?
Yeah.
Or was that someone else doing some creative division on your numbers?
I've done it, or things like the New West Partnership. $1,000 per family is kind of the benefit of joining. If you're from Ontario here, keep that statistic in mind. I think, if I may, I guess as the moderator, I'll just jump in. The challenge there is these estimates are from models. They're not right there, concrete. You can't point to them. You kind of have to trust that, in the long run, we'll see benefits of that right order, and that's really difficult to communicate, even if you can distill it down to a concrete number on an individual basis, or the 6.9%, if you think about the increase in prices that we face as a result of barriers as being more than the GST, but hidden. right? That's concrete, but it all comes from that model as well, which makes it one step, I think, removed from our ability to make it real.
But if it says your prices on things are going to go down, you will have reduced waiting time, something every federal government has come after on healthcare, but this is one way of doing it because it's really about labor. Most of these places are understaffed, and it's not just budget issue. They can't find the people. You know, that's a big problem. And this also leads to other federal public policy issues, or provincial in this case, of professional regulatory bodies. We're bringing in immigrants based on a point system that tells them they're qualified to do these occupations in the country. We're giving you credit for it. Oops, we were duping you. You're actually not allowed to do radiology or a nurse or a doctor. You actually need to go back to school. That's a lie. That has to stop. And we have to go to these professional bodies and make sure that they're called out on it. And I hear at least in one platform that kind of policy will be coming to say you owe these people an answer quickly because they were brought into this country and they were told they could have these occupations. They didn't come to do what they're doing now. So these are, again, all own goals. This is a country that loves to put the puck in its own net. I can't figure that out, but we're in our own way on these issues, and we can get out of the way, and it doesn't take that much courage or leadership if you're able to say to your voters, this is good for you, here's how.
And Goldy, you said earlier that, you know, don't underestimate the collective wisdom of Canadians, and I agree with you on that, and I'm going to marry that with something that I heard in the panel on communication this morning, which is, you know, you have to be relentless about repeating a message. And this issue is having a moment. And I think it is our time to be relentless on communication around this because I don't think in my whole career I've heard interprovincial trade talked about as much as it has been today.
But we can't let it pass. You're right about that because there is a burning platform. You often need a burning platform. We have one. We have no growth. No growth will lead to worse healthcare, worse infrastructure, worse education, worse everything. There's your problem. You have a burning platform. We have no growth. We can debate whether it should be called an industrial policy or whatever. All I care about is where will growth come from? What do you need to bring about growth? How do you create the environment for capital to deploy? Capital has no ideology, no nationality. It has a single anthem, where do I go to make $1, 2? And it will pretty much go anywhere in the world, maybe a couple of countries excluded. Okay? So what can we do to make it attractive for it to be here? This is where I think Canadians cannot be underestimated. They know if it's too good to be true, what we're seeing about redistribution today, they know this is too good to be true and someone's going to pay and it's probably their kids and their grandkids. And they know that's wrong. So we have a burning platform. It's where will growth come from? This is just one part of the solution.
Powerful message there, and I think we have 3 minutes to go. So rapid fire, our last 2 questions. I'll go over off to the left here and then end with the center mic.
Thank you. Ryan Greer with Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. Just to pick up on the current discussion in the last question, I don't think there's any public policy file in my lifetime that's left me more cynical and pessimistic for where it's going to go. And so I'm just wondering if maybe reflecting on your own personal journeys, I mean, 2 of the strongest advocates on this file over the last decade, one of the strongest academic contributors to arguments and evidence, what should we in this room, and I will exclude our government representatives, but industry and academics and others, what should we consider doing differently to try to move this file forward? Because notwithstanding the burning platform, I don't see many governments that are genuinely interested in a growth agenda, let alone one that involves the complexity of tackling these barriers. So, you know, what should we, as interested policy advocacy and other relevant folks be doing differently on this one?
Well, when you're in public policy, you learn how to console yourself sometimes with the smaller victories, because it often is a game of inches. But I've seen that game of inches on many files turn into real changes as you keep pushing, and it's relentless, and you have to never give up and never go away on your issues. So, and I am seeing the game of inches. I mean, when I started, nobody was talking about mutual recognition. Everybody was using harmonization. And the difference between harmonization and mutual recognition, they are oceans apart. Harmonization is we all have to get in a room and agree on one set of rules and what that rule is going to be. Mutual recognition is your standard's good enough for me. I've got my standard, you've got yours. We're good. And so
saying I trust you.
Yeah, and we don't trust each other in Canada. Like, what's more Canadian than trusting each other? Just that shift is huge. And even though I'm saying we need to be bolder and we need to stop looking at it one rock at a time, at least we're using the right language now. We're talking about mutual recognition, and we're doing it kind of one piece at a time. But if we can get bolder about that and start doing more of it, and it's not an or proposition either, it's an and, Ontario joining the New West Partnership, because the New West Partnership is better in many regards than, but I guess it's that determination, that relentlessness, and don't lose hope. We are making some progress. It's just slower than we all want, that's all.
10 seconds just to say that it's not just about IQ, it's about EQ. We need to do a better job telling stories that reach people here about how these things are getting in their way in terms of their own wealth, their own prosperity, their own joy, their own expectations of services they receive from government. This is an emotional, we need to make it more emotional and not just about taxes and regulations and stuff, because that's not going to win the public over.
And for the last word, I'll turn to the center mic, and then we'll just have a quick 30-second response.
My name is Angela Champ. I'm a human resources executive and the author of The Squiggly Line Career. Building on the last two questions, because that was kind of my question, which is, how do we build that awareness in the everyday Canadian? Everybody in this room has already bought into removing or eliminating interprovincial barriers, but how do we, is it Andrew Coyne has to write an article every single day telling Canadians why they should be writing to their MP or their MLA? Individually, what can we do to raise awareness among everyday Canadians?
It's always the toughest question, isn't it? What's the call to action? And I'm not sure Andrew wants to write about it every day, so that might not be our go-to. But I do think that just talking about it, there's a lot of power just in talking about it at the dinner table with your friends, with your neighbors. And again, I go back to what you said about don't underestimate Canadians. Canadians came in behind free trade. Canadians at one time understood that deficits were not a good thing. We've lost some of that, but I'm confident we can get it back. So Canadians, they can get these big, important files, and they want to. I think there is a hunger for solutions. We talked a little bit about that earlier.
Yeah. I would just say very quickly, we're always in an election somewhere in Canada. This is an issue that comes across federally, provincially, and municipally. Every one of our political parties today calls themselves a movement, so they've told us they're going to follow, not lead, so don't expect them to be the ones to drive it. You need to build your own movements around some of these things, and if this is about affordability, it's about cost, it's about health care, get the narrative into any election platform, get it into the election campaign, so at least it's being talked about, because that's not even happening, and I think that's where it starts.
Well, on that note, Laura, Goldy, thank you very much for the great conversation on an important topic, and thank you to everyone here for participating in it. We will break now for, I'm sorry for eating into your coffee break, 12 minutes, before returning here in this room for the final session of the day, featuring a conversation with John Manley, Dwight Duncan, Serge DuPont, and Martha Hall-Finley. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.